award session where we are going to celebrate Professor Ronald Chilcote. Let me start reading the justification that the committee wrote for this award. The committee was composed by 3 former LASA presidents, Lynn Stephan, Mara Viveros, and Joconde Herrera. The awardee of 2021 was Sueli Carneiro, and Carmen Martinez, the current editor of LAR. The 2022 Kalman Silvert Committee decided unanimously to extend the award to Dr. Ronald Chilcote, Professor Emeritus of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Riverside, for his outstanding lifetime contributions to the field of Latin American studies through his academic work, his intellectual leadership as director of Latin American Perspective, his endless efforts to build bridges between Latin American and US scholars, and his mentorship of younger generations. With respect to his academic contributions, Dr. Chilcote is the author of over 200 academic publications in the fields of comparative politics, political economy, development economics, and sociology. Professor Chilcote is a leading scholar of Brazil, Portugal, and Portuguese colonialism. His pioneering work on Lusophone Africa during the 1960s provided a foundation for an African perspective critical of Portuguese presence in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Cabo Verde. His extensive field research in Brazil culminated in 3 university press books, all of which have been translated into Portuguese. His 2010 book, The Portuguese Revolution, State and Class in the Transition to Democracy, was also published in Portuguese and was praised by many scholars such as Boaventura de Sousa Santos. His Intellectual and the Search for National Identity in 20th Century Brazil, published in 2014, is a major work that reflects his decades of research in Brazil and the relationships he developed with Brazilian intellectuals. Professor Chilcote is further recognized as one of the earliest US scholars to assess Latin American dependency theory. His work includes the book Latin America and the Struggle with Dependency and Beyond from 1974, and several issues and articles that were published in Latin American Perspectives. His Theories of Comparative Politics was for 2 decades a leading book for advanced graduate studies in the United States and elsewhere. His intellectual leadership for almost 50 years as managing editor of Latin American Perspectives is an invaluable contribution to the production and dissemination of Latin American studies. From its inception, the journal has emphasized scholarship that analyzes national and transnational systems of power and the movements for structural transformation, social justice, and human rights in Latin America. Among the decisions that made the journal unique were its organization as an independent editorial collective. We will have some of the people from Professor Chilcote's team participating in this session. LAP's ongoing efforts to bring work by scholars in Latin America to English-speaking audiences and its policy for mentoring young scholars was also something that the committee wanted to highlight. Dr. Chilcote also excelled as a teacher and mentor at the University of California, where he was honored with the Distinguished Teaching Award. He played a major role in graduate education, chairing more than 40 dissertation committees and participating in PhD degrees and committed in several US universities and abroad. He served as director of the program on Latin American Studies for over 15 years, but he also established the UC Brazil Studies Center in Rio de Janeiro and served as its director in the early 1990s. Dr. Chilcote is a life member of LASA and has been active in LASA since its founding. Dr. Chilcote has contributed to expanding the organization role in fostering innovative critical scholarship and in encouraging full participation by Latin Americans. For all of the above, the committee considers that Dr. Chilcote widely deserved this important award. Congratulations, Dr. Chilcote. And now let me pass to Ron the floor so he could present us with his lecture entitled The Challenges of Being a Latin Americanist. After that, we'll have the presentations of many voices and many friends and colleagues of Dr. Chilcote.
Muchas gracias, Gioconda, y también por el trabajo del Comité Silvert. Recuerdo que solamente 2 mujeres asistieron en el primer congreso de LASA en 1968. Ninguna de ellas participaron en el comité ejecutivo ni participaron en los paneles. Mucho ha cambiado. Going to speak in English. I thank you very much, Gioconda, in the Silvert Committee. My talk is a small part of a lengthy paper that will be published in LASA's forum. I try to show how my path as a Latin Americanist involved obstacles, but it also reflects on my broad view of Latin American people and problems. The initial challenge was discovering Latin America. At Stanford, after a year in the business school in late 1958, I set off hitchhiking through Mexico and Central America and down the west coast of South America to Chile. And from there, discovering inexpensive train travel that got me to Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, and landing in Havana, Cuba, a few months before Fidel and Che's revolutionary triumph. An amazing venture with limited budget and encountering friendly people everywhere. I returned to Stanford with much enthusiasm. I took every available course on Latin America, no matter the discipline. My vision of Latin America was broad and included Spain and Portugal, and my interest in Portugal eventually extended to its Lusophone empire, in particular to its African colonies. During 1960 and 1961, my partner Francis and I immersed ourselves in intensive courses at the University of Lisbon and the University of Madrid. An editor of Oxford University Press had offered a contract for a book on the fascist Salazar dictatorship, but archival research proved impossible. Useful documents and even many relevant published writings were unavailable, and reporting every week to the secret police was intimidating. We were also in touch with the political opposition and with students from Portugal's African colonies as revolution burst forth in their homelands. By the summer of 1961, they had fled to Paris. I began to build an archive of leaflets and documents of the revolutionary movements and to study accounts of historical African revolts aimed at slave and commodities trade in the colonies. Eventually, I was invited to write a book on Portuguese Africa, and in 1965, I traveled down the west coast of Africa, eventually reaching Luanda, Angola, where I stepped off the plane and was arrested, accused of complicity with the local owner of a beer factory and a Jehovah's Witness missionary to overthrow the colonial government. Interrogated overnight by 6 PD, secret police agents, I was placed in solitary confinement in a dirty, blood-stained prison cell where I went on a hunger strike, and later interrogated for 15 hours daily about a chapter of my book manuscript by a black leather jacketed fascist agent who had been trained by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to do espionage in Macau, an Asian Portuguese colony. It was a horrible experience, but released 10 days later, and on my way home, I did not hesitate to stop in Algiers, then the center of Portuguese African revolutionary movements and Portuguese exiles opposed to the dictatorship. The book was published in 1967, an early effort to depict an African perspective of this historical period. The second challenge deals with manifestations of the Cold War. At Stanford, I was involved in the Institute of Hispanic American and Luso-Brazilian Studies as an editor of the monthly Hispanic American Report, and also as an instructor with a course on current affairs in Latin America. Several difficult moments stand out. First, in its October 1960 issue, HAR reported that Cuban counter-revolutionaries were training in northern Guatemala for what months later became the abortive US-supported Bay of Pigs invasion. This information was drawn from newspaper reports in the region and brought the New York Times and other outlets to Stanford to learn what was happening in Central America. But initially, only The Nation published awareness of it, along with an opinion piece by Ronald Hilton, the editor of HAR and the head of the Institute. Later, this revelation was one pretext for Stanford to remove him from his directorship, close down his institute, and replace it with a new center with a large grant from the Ford Foundation. Secondly, curiously, the Pentagon sent 6 military officers to Stanford for training as Latin Americanists. And we learned thereafter of their counterinsurgency involvement. 2 of them working with Lincoln Gordon to plan the 1964 in Brazil, and another in leading the 1st Brigade of US Marines in the 1965 invasion of the Dominican Republic. Thirdly, many of us were inspired by the Cuban Revolution and its influence elsewhere to study the revolutionary left in Latin America. At Stanford, we organized a seminar for credit for a dozen graduate and undergraduate students, while Tim Harding at UCLA and Don Bray at Pomona College also initiated seminars. The National Student Association supported us with funds that brought our 3 seminars together in 1963 in a 3-day conference in Idlewild, California. Later, we learned from a sensational expose in Ramparts magazine that the funds we had received from the NSA had emanated from the Central Intelligence Agency, and consequently we pulled away from the study of the left. The third challenge relates to professional involvement in the founding of LAP. I have attended all LASA congresses except one in 1970, where younger Latin Americanists were disruptive in the business meeting. I was in the backlands of the Brazilian Northeast, immersed in my field research about 2 communities. But important membership votes occurred on 9 resolutions at the meeting, including one to establish an alternative journal to the Latin American Research Review. The vote was 367 to 174. The resolution favoring an alternative journal of opinion led to the founding of Latin American Perspectives, but independent of LASA. The LASA Executive Council initially responded by asking me to submit a proposal, including a budget. On April 27, 1971, LASA President Federico Gil wrote me, "Let me assure you that the council and I personally have the greatest interest to make it financially possible for the association to comply with the desires of the membership." I submitted a proposal with a budget for $5,000, but LASA had just received a Ford grant for $100,000. But on August 16th, he wrote, "It is clear that the present financial situation of LASA does not permit the use of our own funds for this purpose." Well, not giving up, together with other colleagues, we persisted in our desire to establish a journal. And at the 1973 Congress, LASA Congress in Madison, Wisconsin, we held a meeting of the Radical Caucus, and the proposal to launch LAP was unanimously adopted with me as its managing editor. I promised 25 years. I'm nearly at 50, as you have already expressed. The fourth challenge had to do with field research. Now, the path to field research is usually not smooth, and one must celebrate the past meaningful experiences and not despair the failures. Careful planning may be helpful, but there are always obstacles to meeting commitments. In search of a university position, I had visited the placement office at Stanford only to be herded to an interview with a CIA officer who immediately offered me a job 4 times the salary of the tenure track position I eventually accepted at UC Riverside. At Riverside, I joined a department of 6, 2 of whom, as graduate students, had collaborated with the CIA. Soon after my arrival, I received a letter from a third colleague, then Assistant Vice Chancellor, asking me to cooperate with the CIA upon my return from fieldwork in Brazil the ensuing summer. And earlier, while pursuing research on the Portuguese opposition, I had published an article in the Spanish journal Cuadernos, only to learn it was subsidized by the CIA. Well, my recourse was to follow my own path and not be dependent on any person or institution. My field research always included local institutional support and publication of several of my monographs in Portuguese editions. And the interviews and data available, both in the countries of research and in my extensive personal archive at UCR's Rivera Library's special collection. Our sabbatical year in 1967 began in Rio, where I searched for archives, but the Biblioteca Nacional had little to offer. Bookstores rarely carried what I was interested in, and I soon depended on interviews with intellectuals and their extensive personal libraries, while also following in their paths by building their extensive personal libraries. While also following in their paths, I built my own library of 11,000 books and pamphlets, and this was my means of sustaining my work on Brazil at a time where it was very difficult to find any material. Unlike most of the Brazilianists who came to Rio and Sao Paulo for doctoral research, a few of us settled in the Northeast. I was motivated especially by Euclides da Cunha's Os Sertões, Rebellion in the Backlands. In 1967, I found an unusual way for our family to reach the Northeast, necessitating a 16-hour bus ride through the backlands to the town of Santa Maria at the headwaters of the Rio São Francisco, and an 800-kilometer cruise down the river to Juazeiro, Bahia, on a paddle wheel steamboat, its origins dating to 1862 on the Mississippi River. It was travel beyond expectations, not only reflecting the life and struggles of the dry backlands, but convincing me that my hope for a deep study of the region was possible and necessary. In 1970, when I arrived in Petrolina and Juazeiro, the 2 communities that I studied, I visited Padre Mansueto, director of the region's only radio station. He introduced me to 2 cantadores, or troubadours, whose verse is known as the cordel, a popular means of communicating dating to the 19th century in the Brazilian Northeast. The cantadores were curious about my family and why we were there. Soon they were on the air, singing about Professor Ronaldo and his family and all our plans to study the community. I was convinced that my project would not move forward, given its popular exposure. But the ensuing day, surprisingly, I found myself known to all, rich and poor. And as I and my family moved freely about, we were greeted with friendly curiosity, and soon I felt comfortable in my work and aware of the traditions, lifestyles, and past and present historical, political economy of these 2 small towns, transitioning from dominant paternalistic family rule in search of a better life. Our principal research consisted of in-depth interviews with community notable people during 1970 and 71. It also included a questionnaire that was administered to high school teachers. But everything shut down when a questionnaire reached a part-time teacher who, unknown to our research team, also was an intelligence officer for the local military battalion. Mansueto offered to call the prominent townspeople to a meeting in which I could explain the project. The intelligence officer appeared with his family, including a young son, with a tape recorder. Outside were 4 military jeeps of soldiers with their guns. Although I worried about the transcription of the event and how the military might intervene, afterward, Mansueto affirmed that all was fine. The townspeople were supportive. The ensuing day, everyone greeted me with smiles, and we carried on with the research. As a precaution, I had given Mansueto all my research and data, and upon later leaving town with it, he told me it had been placed in the safest place in town, under the local bishop's bed. Now, my ambitious project was designed for comparative research of 2 contiguous communities in Chile and 2 in Mexico. The study moved to Chile and to La Serena and Coquimbo, 2 towns in the north, in late 1971 and 1972. The project was supported by the Instituto Nacional de Administración, INSORA, of the Universidad de Chile, located in Santiago. We worked closely together. The Institute also sponsored a Russian scholar working on a dissertation and suggested that we debate current ideas of dependency theory critical of US views on capitalism, as well as the Soviet position that underdevelopment was an outcome of semi-feudalism. We agreed to debate, but the Russian, who may have been a KGB agent, did not show. I was excited about the affiliation with the INSORA and the possibility that the research data and findings might be relevant to municipal reform under the Unidad Popular and the Allende government. Alas, it was not to be. The 1973 coup brought an end to the project. The last challenge I wanted to refer to relates to teaching. In 1968, my colleague Carlos Cortez and I launched the first Chicano courses at UC Riverside. His on history and mine on politics. My course was developed in cooperation with MECHA, the Chicano student organization, designed to research important issues related to the Chicano community in nearby South Colton. The Chicanos took on an educational project focused on South Colton, while the Anglos studied the power structure of Colton, which was then under white Anglo rule. Subsequently, there were changes in Colton, including the election of a Chicano school board majority. The Anglo community leaders approached our chancellor to complain about the course, and the UC Board of Regents agreed to investigate and fund a study. A report presumably ensued. I never saw it, nor was I interviewed or sanctioned. In spring 1969, UC Berkeley students protested plans for the People's Park, culminating in Governor Ronald Reagan's calling out the National Guard and resulting in the death of 1 student and injuries to others. I was surprised when 2 of my graduate students, one of them a community organizer from New York City, and the other once involved in UC Berkeley's free speech movement, joined in coordinating the peaceful campus protests and encouraged faculty and students to take their courses into the community. Reagan had ordered the university shut down, but Riverside campus remained peacefully open with its flag at half-mast. However, I was up for tenure and promotion, and a few days later, the chancellor's office sent word that their decision was delayed because of my involvement. Shortly thereafter, one of the student organizers met with the departmental graduate committee requesting he be given a week beyond spring break to travel to Cuba for preliminary work and support for his dissertation. During the meeting, he informally referred to me by my first name and the chairman exploded in anger and sternly replied that his behavior was inappropriate and the committee denied the request. What ensued was a full front page of the student newspaper on what had happened, and thereafter I was known by many on campus and always addressed by my first name among my students. And I came to appreciate the informality. It simply opened dialogue and allowed learning to progress. Now, given all the attention Brazilians had given to me and my family, I committed to give back in two ways. First, through Fulbright professorships in political science at Unicamp in Campinas in 1984, and in sociology at the Universidade Federal de Ceará in Fortaleza in 1984 and 1993. The initial Fortaleza experience was eventful. An hour before first meeting with the graduate student seminar, of which there were some 20 plus students, a departmental colleague warned that my course was too difficult for their students. But undeterred, I met with the students, reviewed the requirements that included a brief written paper each week, and mentioned the concern they might not cope with the course. Several students responded that they were committed to meet all requirements. And for me, it was one of the most satisfactory classroom experiences. All 20-some students completed their coursework on time. 3 of them went on to complete doctoral degrees. And the second means of involvement was on behalf of the University of California Education Abroad program, establishing and directing the Brazil Study Center at the Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro, PUC-Rio, in 1993 and 1994. I set up a program that began with 10 days on a riverboat in the Amazon, followed with 8 weeks of immersion in language and culture in Fortaleza, and a semester program in Rio. These were anxious, urban-based Latinos, enraptured by their new world of nature and wildlife. Some of them hallucinating from the malaria drug the university required, 2 of them having lost their luggage, and another suffering from heat exposure. Then we went on to Fortaleza, and each student living with a local family. In one case, one woman sneaking a male companion in one night, thereby scandalizing her traditional family. Once settled in Rio, it was necessary to discard jewelry and to dress modestly with only small change in pocket and to adopt procedures of caution. Yet there were occasional assaults, frightening, but not of great consequence, that Francis and I experienced 4 of them. Whatever success I may have experienced in this lifetime adventure was largely due to my interest in everything about before me, and not to become mired in a single academic discipline, but to reach out and try to understand Latin America's people, languages, and culture, and in whatever way move forward. Until recently, I did not think much about my past experience as a Latin Americanist. I tried not to dwell on my failures or struggles, yet today I find it exhilarating to reflect on the past, not to celebrate, but to awaken to what was missed along the way and try to fill the gaps of awareness, knowledge, and insight.
Thank you very much, Ron, for this wonderful presentation. I hope we could all be together tonight. I wish we could all be together. Thank you so much for your words, and congratulations again. Now, let me introduce our next speaker. We are going to have 5 to 6 people. I don't know if Professor Kemio Yersun is already with us now. Yes, good, very good. So let me first introduce to Professor Gilbert Joseph from Yale University, who will be our first speaker after Ron's wonderful presentation. Please.
Gracias, Gioconde y al comité por invitarme. It's a great pleasure to add my voice to the diverse chorus celebrating the distinguished and ongoing career of Ron Chilcote this morning. As a past president of LASA, when we were celebrating our 50th anniversary 6 years ago, as one who recently collaborated with Ron on his just released volume, Latin American Studies and the Cold War, and not least, as a member of the then young grad student generation that he and his progressive editorial collective at Latin American Perspectives inspired in the 1970s at the height of the Cold War, it is a particular pleasure to participate in this panel. My first academic article, an essay on the struggles of socialist movements in southeastern Mexico in the wake of the nation's 20th century revolution, was published in LAP in the late 1970s. And truthfully, LAP was the only journal I considered. Decades later, my current cycle of research on Latin America's long Cold War also owes much to Ron's scholarship and the leadership he has provided in organizing panels and editorial projects over the last decade. Indeed, his lengthy career has been coterminous with the development of LASA over the last half century, and his abiding efforts have repeatedly influenced the new directions that Latin American studies and Cold War studies have taken. Ron's recently published collection, Latin American Studies and the Cold War, and I'll hold it up here, it's just out, is an unprecedented achievement, one that all Lacistas would do well to read. It should also find its way into undergraduate classrooms and graduate seminars. Its essays by an international cast of contributors chronicle the genesis and evolution of Latin American studies in multiple locations during the Cold War, not just in the US and Latin America. Some of the contributions double as informal memoirs by the founders, early leaders, and practitioners, not least Ron himself, of what was then and still remains a politically charged field. Here, for the first time, we're able to appreciate Latin American studies development as more than an academic adjunct of inter-American relations and US empire that was largely confined to the Western Hemisphere. Rather, Latin American studies is rightly depicted as a global phenomenon arising in locations as far-flung as Britain, Western Europe, the former Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and China. And for the first time, we learn about Latin American studies professional development in Cuba. These diverse cases make for an interesting comparison, particularly since they are refracted through the volume's dazzling keynote essay by Ron Chilcote on the heady origins of Latin American studies in the United States, some of which you just heard him talk about in his lecture. The field's rise in North America, of course, came in the wake of Cuba's insurgent revolution in the late 1950s, which was followed by Latin American studies' dramatic transformation beginning in the Cold War crucible of the 1960s and 70s. In this process of transformation of Latin American studies over the course of a decades-long Cold War, Ron Chilcote has consistently been both an astute chronicler and an active participant. I am convinced that his leadership in the formation of cornerstone institutions like Latin American Perspectives and NACLA, as well as his firm commitment not to abandon, but rather work for change within what was initially a rather staid and conservative LASA, helped pave the way for the participation and ultimately the leadership of Latin Americans and women in what began as an almost exclusively white male North American association. When LASA celebrated its historic 50th anniversary Congress in 2016, Ron Chilcote organized a featured session that examined the role of the Cold War in the early stages of Latin American studies, eliciting the papers that would eventually form the core of his new volume. It is appropriate now, as his path-breaking collection is being released in time for this LASA Congress, that he be honored with the Kalman Silvert Award, Lasse's highest achievement. I'd be hard pressed to conjure up a scholar, editor, network and institution builder more prolific or more dedicated to advancing Latin American studies. His multifaceted career is not only terribly inspiring, but likely unique. I take supreme pleasure in honoring Ron today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph. And now let me introduce James Green from Brown University, who will be our second speaker in this panel.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, perfectly.
I have the honor today, I have the honor to know Ron Chilcote since 1991, when Tim Harding, Donald Bray, and Marjorie Bray, and Bill Bollinger, my professors, while I was studying for a master's degree in Latin American Studies at California State University, Los Angeles, were generous enough to invite me to participate in a Latin American Perspectives Collective meeting. And they actually, I remember them saying, well, you can't join the collective until you get your master's degree, but we want you to come to the meetings anyway. Throughout the years when I studied at UCLA, obtaining a degree in Latin American history with a concentration in Brazil, and later on as an assistant professor at California State University, Long Beach, I had the honor to participate in the monthly, sometimes grueling editorial meetings of Latin American Perspectives, where Ron, along with his wife, Fran, and very loyal partner in his endeavors, played a fundamental role in guaranteeing the quality and the diversity of the articles from all of the disciplines that appeared in the journal. The dedication, determination, and persistence of his guidance and leadership in ensuring a journal of critical analysis with a founding vision of guaranteeing that active and equal participation of scholars from Latin America and the Caribbean in editorial decisions and the directions of the publication as an essential part of what Latin American still is, what Latin American Perspectives is still today. To this day, LAP remains one of the most important scholarly journals on Latin America and the Caribbean, with a commitment to accepting articles in Spanish and Portuguese, and if accepted, translated into English. This quite radical posture has made sure that Latin American Perspectives remains an academic journal which is truly accessible for those scholars from all of the regions of Latin America and the Caribbean who want and need to publish in English. Furthermore, in the 1990s, Ron has led the journal through the process of significant expansion. And I remember in collective meetings predicting erroneously that LAP might actually lose its importance in those years. And in fact, Ron managed to convince the people publishing the journal to increase its periodicity by coming out 6 times a year, and it has become and remains one of the most important cutting edge publications in the discipline. More recently, I was contacted by Cambridge University Press to evaluate one of Ron's long-term projects, namely to document the history of Brazilian intellectuals. The book's Intellectuals and the Search for National Identity in 20th Century Brazil is a brilliant study based on extensive interviews with these intellectuals conducted by Ron in the late 60s, with additional follow-up interviews with these individuals and others in the 1980s, and a scattering of subsequent recorded conversations carried out in recent years. In the book, he carefully studies their ideas and knowledge in theory and practice, doing an amazing job of identifying all of the major and minor intellectuals who have worked on the issues of nationalism, developmentalism, modernity, and democracy, and showing his close understanding of the literature that has been produced on these topics over the last 5 decades. Like almost all of his other works he has produced on Brazil, from the history of the Brazilian Communist Party, Conflict and Integration, 1922 to 1972, published by Cambridge University Press, which is now a classic study on the topic, to the work he mentioned today, Power and the Ruling Classes in Northeast Brazil, Juazeiro and Petrolina in Transition, Ron has proven to be a scholar with a broad intellectual range that expands beyond Latin America and the Caribbean to a deep understanding of the Iberian Peninsula and Africa. And finally, on a personal level, Ron has been a dedicated mentor, supporting generations of young scholars who work on Latin America and the Caribbean as they progress through their careers, including those young scholars in the Latin American Collective, encouraging their participation in the journal's decision-making process, publication of articles by these young authors, many times who don't have a long CV to justify their work. Ron, you are unquestionably deserving of this honor that LASA has bestowed on you as the 2022 recipient of the Kalman Silvert Award. As Gil just mentioned, there are very few people who get close to you in the range, the depth, the breadth, and the care that you have for Latin America, for the Caribbean, for Africa, for the Iberian Peninsula. And we're very, very happy to be celebrating that with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And then we have Kemi Oyarsun, a former colleague of Ron at UC at California and currently professor at the Universidad de Chile, I guess. Please, Kemi, adelante.
Yes, thank you very much. I wrote in English, although my English is getting worse and worse. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to tribute Ronald Chilcote upon reception of this impressive, important, and well-deserved award. I believe nothing would be more rewarding than knowing the impact he had on us. I was a student at that time. I was a student at UC Irvine. And what does this have to do with Ronald's trajectory? Well, I've discovered in the process of writing this testimony that his life has had an important, I would say, enormous impact upon my becoming a subject, tattooed by otherness, by power relations, by class and gender and race. For that is what characterizes my being in this world. And Ron is one of those key persons that really have kept my life and my faith going, as he really impacted the way I am. I met him when I was still a PhD student at UC Irvine. He had just come back from Chile in 1972, and the Popular Unity government was undergoing key structural transformations with the acceleration of complete nationalization of the copper industry and some strategic productive sectors. It was an era of complex political problems. I won't just be another president. I will be the first president of the first really democratic, popular, national, and revolutionary government in the history of Chile, Salvador Allende said. At that time, I was a Chilean immigrant and fully identified myself as a Latina, a Chicana, I used to say. The Chicano movement was fully blooming, questioning the borders of difference and indifference, racism, and the fragile bonds of liberal representative democracy. My socialist father had migrated to California during the fray Christian democratic government, fully disenchanted after Allende's third attempt to become a president. At UC Irvine, I joined a Marxist study group made up of professors and students. We started a Chilean new song movement folk group. I would play the guitar and the panpipe. And I would travel north and south in California singing Violeta Parra, Inti Yemani, Quilapayún songs. We were living at the height of the Cold War, and Latin America had staged intense protests against the Vietnam War. Between 1972 and 1974, I worked very close with Ron and with the Latin American Perspectives Collective, deeply marked by the strong bonds camaraderie in the journal. It's hard work. It's solid commitments to theoretical discussions. It's critical analysis. It's profound respect for Latin America's leadership. It's unusual combination of discipline and warmth. Ron expressed that new type of leadership. I have followed a lot of those traits in my life. As a Latin American student, I was deeply marked by his combination of horizontal respect for students, while at the same time leading a type of leadership that demanded commitment without falling into authoritarianism, one that was able to evaluate others while at the same time opening up for self-evaluation. I remember that he personally checked our commitments as students, calling us almost daily, offering support while at the same time teaching how to teach, how to keep faithful to what we believed in our theory and our daily practice. Coming from a country in which leadership was often thought to be vertical and even patronizing, I felt recognized as a subject of sovereignty, autonomy, yet fully linked to collective anti-imperialist work, radical democracy, and socialism. I imagine that I am not going to be able to talk too long, so I'm going to run two of the three strands of theory in those days, key for Latin American perspectives, impacted me very much. The role of imperialism and dependency. Dependency theory, you may recall, advanced in the context of the popular unity's difficult transition from a capitalist, singular third world at that economy to a Chilean type of socialism. Runs close contacts with Brazil, brought discussions of dependency to the collective. I mean works by Fernando Enrique Cardoso, Teotonio dos Santos, among many others. Much of it was theoretically produced and socialized in Chile and was avidly debated in the US. Black power, gay, and feminist movements were also bringing different shades of problems, some which traditional Marxism had not fully addressed in the United States. When the military coup happened in Chile, I was at the last period of my PhD at UC Irvine. I had just come back from a short visit to Chile in hopes of returning to live there in spite of the turbulent days the country was going through. I arrived in California 2 days after the coup and headed a protest event at San Francisco Union Square with Angela Davis. At that point, I promised myself not to go back to the university until democracy was regained in Chile. Can you tell me if I have 1 more minute or so? I don't know.
2.
Sure.
2 more minutes.
2 more.
Go
2
ahead.
more.
Yes, you
Yes,
can.
thank you.
We are fine with.
Well, I could not compare the power of books and words with the impact of our disappeared people. As I speak today, I think of Ron, Tim, Marjorie, Bill, and so many others who organized solidarity movements like LAGLAS, along with exile groups from Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. I worked along with non-intervention in Chile and created Chile Democrático. Became very involved in human rights activism, along with campesino women, trade unions, and churches. I rarely saw Ron in the collective, but kept up with the journal. I became more and more attracted to its feminist critiques of the way we engaged Marxism in questions of gender relations between domestic and public spheres, production and reproduction. And I owe Ron and the journal opening up those queries with Jim Franco's issue on women. Finally, I'm going to end. Finally, I got an L in my passport in 1975 when Orlando Letelier was killed. That L meant I couldn't return to Chile in 12 years. Finally, I did return after those 12 years and started a career at the University of Chile, but came back to work as a grantee to study Brazilian cordel movement, which is a movement that is very creative in the northeast of Brazil, but also has had an impact on the arpilleras movement. I don't know if you know what they are. They were patchwork that the Chilean women did, and in the prisons also. Well, I met Ron again, and we shared his collection of photography, incredible, and the Cordel collection at UCR, sorry. Courage, persistence, a tremendous generosity, incredible tenacity and stubbornness, a joy, which is very uncommon, a joy for struggling and fighting radical democracy, socialism, and for me, from a feminist class and indigenous identities. Today, we had two incredible protests in 2017 in Chile from a feminist protest, and in 2018, a mass revolt that changed the constitution of Chile as we are advancing for a constitution which guarantees human rights, social rights, sexual and reproductive rights. It has already approved it in the constitution, and I am sure it will change some of the neoliberal persistent character of post-dictatorial Chile. I am happy, proud to salute and to greet this very merited award that Ron Chilcote is receiving, and in a sense, we are all receiving through his incredible example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kemi, for sharing with us all these experiences together next to Ron. Now, let me introduce Mónica Díaz Martins from the Universidade Estadual de Ceará in Brazil. Mónica, please. Adelante.
Eu vou falar em português, que é a língua do meu coração, porque assim eu posso expressar melhor a emoção que eu sinto nesse momento. Querido professor, mestre e amigo de toda uma vida, é com enorme alegria que eu participo deste momento em que celebramos sua vida, dedicada ao estudo das teorias marxistas, da dependência e a sua especial contribuição à compreensão dos processos sociais na América Latina e no Caribe. A premiação da LASA é uma justa homenagem e um reconhecimento público. Era o segundo semestre de 1984, quando eu conheci Ron na condição de professor visitante da Fulbright, na Universidade Federal do Ceará. No seu seminário intitulado Teorias do Desenvolvimento, estavam presentes mais de 20 jovens estudantes, inclusive eu. Estávamos ansiosos para conhecer o que um gringo tinha a dizer sobre a sociedade brasileira no momento de transição para a nova república, após mais de 2 décadas de ditadura militar. Aos poucos, nos aproximamos e descobrimos o intelectual comprometido e militante, que nos estimulava, com seu jeito sério, a entender o capitalismo e os seus impactos em uma região da periferia. Ele nos falava da experiência vivida junto com sua esposa, Frances, no Chile, em Angola, Guiné-Bissau. Ele apresentava suas ideias do livro Teorias de Política Comparada, A Busca por um Paradigma, nos indicava obras clássicas e contemporâneas de sociologia e de economia política. Enfim, as aulas eram um verdadeiro debate, onde nós interpretávamos os paradigmas reformistas e revolucionários do desenvolvimento e do subdesenvolvimento. Ainda hoje guardo com muito carinho e orgulho as anotações feitas por Ron a lápis em meus trabalhos acadêmicos no mestrado em sociologia. Seus comentários me ajudaram a adquirir alguns hábitos que carrego até hoje: leitura cuidadosa, síntese de ideias, revisão crítica da literatura, redação clara. Nas palavras de Ron, ensaios muito úteis para você, Mônica, e a sua formação futura. Nos anos 90, Ron voltou ao Brasil em um programa de intercâmbio da Universidade da Califórnia e trouxe para o Ceará um grupo de jovens estudantes para conhecer a dura realidade do sertão. Ele tinha recentemente publicado Poder e Classe Dominante no Nordeste do Brasil, Juazeiro e Petrolina em Transição, resultado de uma pesquisa muito importante nas cidades do estado da Bahia e Pernambuco, às margens do Rio São Francisco, onde eu tinha lutado contra a ditadura. Na época, militando junto aos movimentos sociais camponeses, organizei uma viagem às comunidades que lutavam por reforma agrária, ocupavam terras improdutivas, formavam assentamentos de trabalhadores rurais e cooperativas agrícolas. Foram dias de intensa atividade, observação de campo, ida aos roçados, aos currais, entrevista com as lideranças, reuniões com as famílias. Apesar do enorme calor e das dificuldades de transporte e acomodação, as visitas às comunidades tiveram uma grande relevância para estudantes que, pela primeira vez, entraram em contato com o modo de vida do agricultor, do vaqueiro, do irrigante e do sem-terra. Na avaliação final da experiência, em Fortaleza, Ron fez uma análise brilhante da economia nordestina e de como o capitalismo penetrou na região com a produção de açúcar e a criação de gado, destacando as mudanças em curso e ressaltando que eram fruto da resistência dos trabalhadores. Este foi um momento marcante e ele me estimulou a prosseguir os estudos e a ingressar no doutorado, coisa que eu nunca tinha pensado, porque eu gostava mesmo era da militância política. Concluo as breves palavras com um agradecimento sincero por ele ter me aceito na Universidade da Califórnia como bolsista da CAPES Fulbright nos anos de 1998 e 1999 para realizar o doutorado sanduíche. E por ter me acolhido como participante na revista Latin American Perspectives, onde eu permaneço desde então como Associate Editor. Graças ao apoio recebido, pude concluir minha tese de doutorado e ingressar na universidade. Açúcar no Sertão, a ofensiva capitalista no Nordeste do Brasil, foi publicada em 2008. Hoje sou professora e tenho Ron como minha grande inspiração.
Thank you, Monica. Obrigado. And
De
now,
nada. Thank you so much.
now we are going to continue with another student of Ron, Jaudat Abuel. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, actually in the West Coast, and it's afternoon in Fortaleza. I send you a forte abraço. I send forte abraço to Ron and friend Chilcote from Fortaleza, and to let them know that all their friends and former students were thrilled by the news of the Silvert Award. I myself feel honored to be part of the celebration of Ron's decades of generous giving to the Academy, students, and social knowledge. This highly prestigious recognition of his achievements and scholarly contributions to the US and Latin American academic communities is also a recognition of Latin American perspectives' importance in the field. Today, I will focus my brief comments on two issues, Ron the human being and Ron the scholar. I met Ron in '83 when I was starting my graduate studies in political science at UC Riverside. I had chosen energy policy within the public policy area as my doctorate theme. But it just took me one seminar, comparative politics, to change the course of my professional career and even my personal life, because I moved to Fortaleza. Ron's seminar on comparative politics had at least 15 participants, highly motivated to debate new themes he had introduced since the early 1970s in his pioneering books and articles that literally had influenced the area of comparative politics in the US. Development and underdevelopment, dependence, imperialism, internal colonialism, the state, power, modes of production, etc., etc., etc. Graduate students' enthusiasm can be directly related to his personality: open-minded, encouraging, disciplined, highly disciplined, entrepreneurial, generous, willing to donate many hours to the advancement of his students and colleagues. Those are the same attributes that made Latin American Perspectives, under his leadership, a groundbreaking forum for Latin American studies. Ron is the type of person that pushes everybody to improve, whether students or colleagues, always demanding, but also patient and caring. With his support and encouragement, as he did with many of his graduate students who went to other places in Latin America, I went to Fortaleza and became a professor at the Federal University of Ceará. Ron had been a Fulbright scholar at Unicamp, Federal Pernambuco, and Federal Ceará in the 1980s, and returned in 1993 and 1994 to Fortaleza as a Fulbright teaching comparative politics and development. In Fortaleza, I met so many of his former students. Many had participated in his seminars, and as usual, his support led to several doctorate dissertations. Many of my colleagues in the department which attended Ron's seminars, I name only a few: Mônica Martins, which is here today with us, Josenho Parente, Filomeno, Joraci, Ereleno, Moema, Moreira, and others, including faculty such as Andrea Aguiar, César Barrera, Auxiliadora Lemenha, Silvia Portalegre, and others also, always ask about him and fondly remember his talks. In Brazil, 4 of his many books have significant influence in the academy. The Brazilian Communist Party, Conflict and Integration, published in '74, is considered to be a classic on the Brazilian left. Teorias de Política Comparativa, originally published by Westview, but translated by Vozes in 1997, is a massive review of the literature widely used in graduate seminars in the US and in Brazil. His latest book, Intellectuals and the Search for a National Identity, 2014 by Cambridge, will definitely become a classic on Brazilian intellectuals and their influence in politics. But specifically, I will refer to his work on the Northeast, Transição Capitalista e a Classe Dominante no Nordeste, published in 1990 by Cambridge and 1991 by USP and Queiroz, a case study that took 3 decades to complete, is an innovative interpretation on capitalist development in the country. Beyond the traditional, and I would say rather simplistic, analysis of the Northeast, he showed the dichotomy between the latifundio and the modern capitalist enterprise was a theoretical mirage. He argued that they converged in the region to form a dynamic export-led sector that was fed by surplus labor extracted from low-income rural workers. I can go on and on describing many other intellectual contributions of Ronald Chilcote, but his most enduring is his insistence on opening academic and intellectual forums to new knowledge. And I would mention LAP as his greatest endeavor, a journal that is receptive to new generation of social scientists and to Latin American scholars that enriched our perception of the plight of the popular masses for social justice. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this event. Forte abraço, grato por tudo e principalmente pela amizade. Yeah? Parabéns, Ronald. Obrigado.
Obrigado. Thank you very much. And now we'll have Alfonso Gonzalez, who is the current director of the Latino and Latin American Studies Research Center at UC Riverside. Alfonso, please.
Buenos días, buenas tardes. Me llamo Alfonso Gonzalez Toribio. I'm the director of the Latino Latin American Studies Research Center at UCR. And I also feel the weight of being the Ronald H. Chilcote Endowed Chair in Latino and Latin American Studies. I'll talk about the endowed chairship in a bit, but my comments here today are Ronald H. Chilcote, a committed left intellectual in neoliberal times. And I just want to emphasize that Ron Chilcote is an intellectual to emerge out of the material conditions of the 20th century, the Cold War, the transition from the Fordist sort of the Fordist mode of the Fordist organization of the economies of Keynesian Fordist moment in the economies in the United States, Mexico, Latin America, who brings his radical critique into the 21st century. And this was only possible by his steadfast commitment to intellectual work. I have to say that his work in particular, his book on theories of comparative politics absolutely helped me get through graduate school when I was, thrown into the very first time into a PhD program where I was the only Mexican or Chicano in the PhD program in political science at UCLA when I started, definitely in my cohort, but probably the only one that wasn't an international student. And I was really in over my head. And Ron has a gift for explaining complex theoretical ideas in an accessible language, right? He's someone who can really unfold the key aspects of debates. And that book was central for me to get to graduate school. But I want to say something about the moment. Why do we appreciate Ron so much at this moment? Because in the times of neoliberal capitalism, they promote individualism like never before, right? And there is a moment, at least in the US Academy, where we've lost a sense of intellectual community, where there's been such a normalization. There is such a normalization of heterodox ideas that, when you're doing your PhD in economics in the US or in political science, I just made this point at a talk recently. If you're doing your PhD in political science at UCLA or at Berkeley, you're not going to get a seminar on Marx. You're not even going to learn the basics of Hegel, Marx, let alone dependency theory. And this has been normalized. We just call it political science or you just call it economics, but this really neoliberal, neoclassical economics or heterodox approaches to political science, but they've been normalized. And then what I appreciate most about Ron is that he's weathered the storm. He's weathered the intellectual storm in which many former left intellectuals either went to postmodernism or completely abandoned their positions and just became mainstream scholars. And we have to just, I think, historicize Ron's contributions in that respect, right? To think about really the structural forces and the trends in the neoliberal university that he weathered. And I have to say, in the times of immense individualism, LAP has created a true community of scholars. I think only because of the pandemic, most of LAP's activities have gone online. But prior to the pandemic, we were having meetings in our homes. And Ron, part of his tremendous style of leadership is to be consistent and persistent. And what I mean by consistent, well, for 50 years, LAP has been meeting in person. And there's this tremendous community of scholars, Bill Bollinger, the Brays, Ward Shank, Stephen Elner, but so many folks here, so many scholars here that have been meeting in person. I just can't emphasize how important this group of scholars meeting in person for the last 50 years, how important that has been to forging this intellectual community. And it's that community that should be juxtaposed to the individualism of the modern neoliberal academy. And that's what's really made LAP survive. And that's what's made LAP be consistent. To create a forum for critical thought in Latin American studies, Marxism, dependency theory. I think dependency theory in the US would have been lost. We would have been lost for English translation of dependency theory had it not been for Ronald Chilcote and Latin American perspectives. There would be much, much less material had it not been for Latin American perspectives. To have a journal, to be critical of capitalism and to be openly for socialism is such a unique thing when we consider the evolution of the neoliberal university in the US in the last 30, 40 years. I gotta say that he's consistent and persistent. What I mean by the consistency is obviously the meeting over the 50 years, but also persistent. If you've ever tried to tell Ronald Chilcote no, you know he's gonna ask you again. And all of you, I'm sure, have experienced that. If Ron asks you to do something, you say, you know, I really can't, and he'll ask you again, and he'll ask you again until you do it. And you know, some people might not like that, but that's the secret sauce to keeping Latin American perspectives alive. It really is, and it's part of his leadership style. And had he not been like that, it would have been a one-man show over the last 40, 50 years, and it hasn't, because Ron has really been there to get people to step up and to take on responsibilities. The other key element to his leadership style, obviously he's well organized, but he has very high expectations and a commitment to quality. So he's built intellectual community, right, based on, you know, intellectual principles and a commitment to critical thought, but it's based on high quality. Ron no acepta cualquiera. O sea, Ron is not just, well, we want community for community's sake and everyone can be part of this. Had he been like that, me and Romina Robles Rubalcaba, who's also an editor, probably the youngest editor in LAP, but also one of the more committed of the younger generation, we had said, you know, we were talking, we were saying, had Ron been just very liberal and like, oh yeah, everyone come in, take the leadership, sure, I'm gonna step down and no, you're the leader, LAP wouldn't have survived. LAP wouldn't have survived. So he's really balanced commitment, leadership, with bringing in new talent, but making sure they're talented and making sure they're committed and making sure they have a commitment to the work, but that they also have the intellectual critique down. You have to have the critique, right? I mean, Ron is not gonna accept anything. He's got such a commitment to high quality work, and now that I've stepped in, you know, I've been the director of the Latin American Studies program, which Ron founded, which is the major, since 2017, and now I'm director of the center, and the center was founded in 2020 during the pandemic. Now that I've sort of transitioned, you know, after tenure into these leadership roles, I think prior to tenure, I don't think I would have really been able to fully appreciate the type of leader that Ron is. But now that I'm in these leadership roles, I see, you know, when you're in a leadership role, you can't just be opening everything to everyone and making it just el que quiere aquí ven, you know, you can't, you have to have that commitment to quality, and it has to be along a particular intellectual left critical tradition that Ron has kept alive. And I just gotta say, he has my highest admiration. The other point I want to make about Ron is his contributions to Chicano studies and then and to Latino studies more broadly. As he mentioned, he's taught the first class, him and Carlos Cortez, who's about Ron's age, and he was also professor emeritus at UCR. They taught the first Chicano studies classes in the 1960s. But I think what people don't realize is that Ron trained two of the most important Chicano political scientists of our generation, and that is, definitely to come out of UCR, which is Armando Navarro, who recently passed away just March 26th. Armando Navarro passed away. Armando Navarro was a critical Chicano intellectual. They wrote 8 books and had 2 books in process at the same time when he passed away. was someone that had a tremendous impact on the Chicano Latino community in the Inland Empire and nationally. He was trained by Ron. He was trained by Ron. Like, where would we be had Ron not trained Armando Navarro? Where would we be had Ron not trained Adalgisa Sosa Rydell, who got her PhD in political science under Ron in the 1970s, like 73 or 74, and became the founder of the Chicano Studies Department at UC Davis, and also became the founder of MALS, Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social. So these were Chicanos like Armando Navarro and Adalgisa Sosa Rydell, who come out of the Inland Empire when this was an agricultural community. These are people who were salt of the earth, that came from a working class, semi-campesino background, and they were able to get a world-class education in political science under a Marxist independency tradition, under the leadership and mentorship of Ronald Chilcote. And we can never, these folks, there's been events commemorating the lives of these folks as well. And they've done tremendous contributions. Moran es el maestro de maestros, right? El profesor de profesores, who's formed critical intellectuals. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that he trained Ward Shank. And Ward Shank, at least here in Riverside, the Inland Empire, Ward Shank has been also another tremendous asset to the Latino community here in the Inland Empire. He taught at RCC, and he's got the same, because he was trained by Ron, he is committed, has high expectations, and had many of us reading dependency theory, reading Latin American perspectives at, as first year, second year students in community college. And no one's done more to train young, critical left intellectuals at the community college than Ward Shank. All of these folks are Ron's students, el maestro de maestros, right? ¿Cómo va el tiempo?
Ya, tenemos que terminar.
Voy a terminar este último punto.
Yeah.
And last but not least, Ron, he told me not to mention this, and this only speaks to his humility, but Ron gave the center, he gave us a $1 million endowment. And with that endowment, we're funding left intellectuals from Ecuador. We're funding all kinds of programming here, a documentary on detention in the Inland Empire. We're taking a delegation to la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM this week. Es el encuentro México-Americano sobre la crisis del capitalismo mundial y la sociedad civil y migraciones. All of this is made possible by Ron's work. And I just have to say that your legacy is firmly cemented in the intellectual history of the region and of Latino America. You'll continue to be a beacon of light and leadership for us for decades to come. Thank you, Ron.
Well, thank you so much, Alfonso. Muchísimas gracias. We are running out of time, but it's very important for this session to also have the brief interventions of the collective team, the collective work behind LAP. So just let me give the floor to Rosalind, George, Steve, Marjorie, and Timothy, and Bill. So please, Rosalind Bresnahan, go ahead, and we'll have very small interventions from each one of you, please.
Okay, well, as like everyone else, I could go on and on about all of the contributions of Ron to the field of Latin American studies, but I'll focus on just one area, which is one of the areas that I work in for the journal, which is translations. I've been involved with LAP now for almost 20 years, and I'm still in awe of the amount of work that Ron accomplishes, not only his own production, but overseeing the journal and all his other activities we haven't gotten into. But one of his central commitments has been to increase the flow on the circuit of knowledge from south to north and back and forth. And one of the ways of doing that was making sure that LAP, even as a shoestring operation run by some untenured, assistant professors with no institutional backing, took on the commitment to translate. The first issue of LAP on dependency had articles by Rodolfo Stavenhagen, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, and Andre Lunder Frank, all translated by LEP. We maintain the tradition. We translate about 40 articles a year, a little more Spanish than Portuguese, but about 40 altogether. And Ron is always looking for new ways to do this. We have the book that was talked about earlier, The Cold War and Latin American Studies. We're translating that entire book into Spanish that will be published in collaboration with Claxo. We are doing selected articles from LAP in Spanish and Portuguese in a volume called LAP in Español y Portugués, again in collaboration with Claxo. So Ron is always finding new ways to expand and complete the circuit of dialogue and discussion and sharing of knowledge, particularly through a commitment to not letting language barriers impede that process. It's been a pleasure to be part of it.
Thank you so much. George Leddy.
I'll be very brief. I work with Rosalind on Portuguese translations, but I also manage the book reviews in LAP. LAP's book review policy comes from Ron's insights into what constitutes what is important to our readers. And in that respect, LAP is quite different from other journals. One of the things we do is that we're very selective about the books we choose to review, and we cluster them into thematics that often match the theme of the 5 issues a year, which have a thematic out of our 6 issues. And in this respect, every issue is a very rich field of material that includes as many as 3 or to 6 book reviews. On an annual basis, we review approximately on average about 30, but in some years even 38 books. And our policy is to choose books that have 2 contributions to make. One would be that the book represents some critical framework, an important theoretical contribution in that respect, but that it also have some important empirical background, that it touched the ground in some way. Occasionally, we do review a book that is phenomenally important in theoretical terms, and in that case, we will not cluster that review. We will give that review a standalone treatment. That is also true of publications by our editors, so that when you see that in LAP, it's because we're reviewing recent work by some of our editors. We consider 800 words per title, and that's actually unusual for a lot of journals. Ron Chilcote mentioned to me that he picked that up and contributing to other journals. And in that sense, our reviews are actually vetted by our collective. They're careful and they do justice to the author's contributions. We really do select those in a way to advance the mission of LAP. So thanks to Ron's leadership in that, I think we stand out in our approach to book reviews. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Now, Steve Elner, very brief.
Yes, I want to say a few words on Latin American Perspectives evaluation process, which I've been closely involved with over the last couple of years. And the first and perhaps most important point I want to make is the degree to which manuscripts that are submitted to the journal go through a rigorous examination process. Some of the manuscripts are screened out at the outset. That is, after a short reading, we decide not to send the manuscript out to editors, either because of quality or because it's a bad fit for the journal. But even in that case, there is an evaluation process, and we provide the authors with meaningful criticisms and suggestions. But that only represents about 5% of the manuscripts that come in. At the same time, very few manuscripts are accepted on the first round without required revisions. Our evaluators, who are for the most part editors, what we call participating editors and other editors, they fill out a form which breaks down the evaluation in which specific criteria are graded, subject to appropriateness, organization, analysis of data, style, etc. And then 4 overall grades: publish with little editing, publish requires revision, substantial revision, and reject. And most manuscripts go through at least 2 or 3 rounds of revision, even ones which that have been accepted and they have an acceptance rating because the revisions that are called for are considered mandatory. The second point I want to quickly make, which is also extremely important, is that Latin American Perspectives is one of the few, perhaps the only journal in the United States that accepts manuscripts in other languages, in this case, Spanish and Portuguese. Furthermore, as George mentioned, once an article in one of those two languages are accepted for publication, the journal translates it into English. And this is a policy is related to a single objective of the journal, which Ron has always emphasized in meetings. And that is that the journal is not a US journal. It's a journal of the Americas, and that includes all of the Americas. And that position actually dates back to the founding of the journal, which Ron discusses in detail in his book that just came out, Latin American Studies in the Cold War, in which he points out that the journal originated as a result of a critique of many of the leading founding members of LASA, that they researched Latin America without going there, Kalman Silvert being an exception. But this critique is a legacy of Latin American perspectives, which influences decisions made by the journal practically on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Fortunately, the world has changed, and LASA too.
That's for
Thank
sure.
you. Marjorie Bray, please. We have we are really running out of time, so please 1 minute each one, and that would be really great.
My role here today is to call attention to and celebrate the role of Frances Chilcote in Latin American perspectives. When our husbands were at Stanford, she and I each contributed to the Hispanic American Report country articles each month. And when our husbands and other LASA members who were professors in Southern California decided they needed to start a more progressive journal, we were part of the group, and graduate students as well, with Ron as our leader. Frances's role was special. She kept notes on what we decided and made sure the decisions were followed through. She edited articles that were submitted by our contributors. I have it all written. She was the final copy editor that we now have a professional do. She organized our exhibits at LASA. She became the treasurer and prepared the balance sheets that are presented to the collective every year. All this while being Ron's supportive life partner, mother, grandmother, intrepid companion during foreign residence and other trips for research and education, wonderful hostess in Laguna Beach in Wyoming, and good friends to those who are fortunate enough to know her. Thank you, Frances.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, for these wonderful words.
It was better.
Un abrazo para Francis
Wonderful.
también. Timothy Harding. Tim, please.
Okay, I just unmuted. Well, there's so much been said, and in the few seconds I have, I want to start by saying that this award has brought us together, friends from years back who haven't been able to speak to each other. And today we were able to communicate around the issue of Ron Chilcote's wonderful lifetime achievements. I started with Ron when we were graduate students at Stanford working on the Hispanic American Report. And Ron explained briefly how the Hispanic American Report and the Institute were destroyed by the action of the US government because we were doing such a good job of reporting on what was happening in Latin America. And it enraged the US policy people, and they destroyed the Institute and our journal. And then, not to let that remain, Ron got us together and we organized a new journal, Latin American Perspectives. And we brought together as editors all of you and people from every country in Latin America, from the former Soviet Union, from Spain and Portugal. And it's been a wonderful experience and an enormous contribution to students studying about Latin America, going up through undergraduate and graduate school, to have the issues of Latin American perspectives, to be able to go back and find the articles that explain the things that they're studying and expand their understanding of what was going on. Much of what I would ordinarily say has already been said by the rest of you, but I just want to thank Ron for his wonderful job of keeping us together.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Tim. And then our last speaker, Bill Bonger.
Thank you, Chicano. Ron's lecture, I can't wait to see it published by LASA. I think what we've heard today are the seeds of a memoir. And I would hope that all of us present today will hold Ron accountable. He needs to shift some of his energy into producing this beautiful and rich memoir. He only scratched the surface in his lecture, but among his many other talents, he's a photographer and links photography to his concern for nature. And that too will be a wonderful chapter of this memoir. So I hope we'll hold him accountable to producing that. Not that he has a lot of free time right now, but maybe we can lighten his journal load. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I think I miss one more person. Joanna, please. And then, of course, Ron, I will let you also do some words. I've been told that we'll still have 5 more minutes, so that's fine. Please, Joanna, go ahead.
Thank you, Gioconda. Boa tarde a todos. Good morning, good afternoon. We are in different countries. So I am in São Paulo. I'm Joanna. And well, I met Ron in 2017, very recent, when I was a visiting PhD researcher at UC Irvine, supervised by Professor Heidi Tinsman. And the historian Cliff Welsh put me in contact with LAP editors. And then Rhonda and Rosalind invited me to join a meeting. And then I started a long and interesting dialogue with Ron about his trajectory in Brazil, about his whole life dedicated to LAP project and to Latin American studies, and also about the updated debates on development challenges and dependency obstacles in Latin America. I then became a LAP fellow in 2018, when I investigated the archives of Ronald Chilcote's special collection and participated in several meetings of the editorial collective when I was in US. And after that, I had this terrific opportunity to co-edit a special issue with Ron, published this year in 2 volumes entitled Reassessing Development, Past and Present Marxist Theories of Dependency and Periphery Debates, that coincidentally have just arrived at my home in São Paulo today, a few hours ago, physically. This special issue contains 27 articles wrote by more than 30 authors from 6 Latin American countries, expressing the most updated theoretical debates on development and dependency in contemporary Latin America, the obstacles and challenges of Latin American economic emancipation in plural and critical perspectives, and also many case studies. I had permanently asked myself why Ron trusted me this huge responsibility as a young Brazilian historian that had moved back to São Paulo and I am still trying to figure it out. But I'm constantly grateful because I have learned so much with him during these last 4 years co-editing this special issue. Ron taught me so much about so many things that I wouldn't have time to list everything. He taught me about the editorial process, about which one is the best language to criticize other authors' manuscripts. He taught me about some techniques of the reviewing process and explained how constructive the dialogue between reviewer and authors could be. Indeed, he always stressed the pedagogical role of this invisible dialogue behind the curtains of the editorial work. In the backstage of our special issue, we had more than 70 authors and 200 reviews. Many works were improved patiently, and Ron taught me about the importance of this patience. My conclusion is that Ron is a great editor and a great Latin Americanist because he's a man of dialogue, which means he's a great teacher and a great listener. This award is a happy recognition of his whole life work, the quality of his production, and also the collective impact of his generous, internationalist, academic, and activist mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I think we have had a very rich and very fantastic homage celebration for Ron. I don't know if Ron wants to give us some final words. There are also messages in the chat of congratulations, of course. But Ron, if you want to say some words now before we end this session.
Thank you, Chilcote. You've done a marvelous job in pulling together so many people. This is a very ambitious effort. My desire was to try to bring in the people who really have shaped my life and my career and have made a difference. I'm really appreciative that Joanna had a chance to participate. It was not planned for the end, but the end was very, very appropriate. She's expecting a child, I think next week, and we weren't sure she was going to be with us. But she is an amazing young woman.
Fantastic.
Who is really, truly a Latin Americanist. One of the problems of Latin American academics way back was they always focused on their country, and their writings were always being published in their country, nowhere else. There were exceptions, of course. But Joanna did her master's thesis on Cuba and published a book on Cuba. She's done her dissertation on Chile, and a book will be coming out. And she is just an amazing young editor with whom I've enjoyed working these last 2 years on these two issues that just came out for LAP. And she took me back to where we began, and the issues take us back to where we began, because it was dependency theory that was the changing paradigm, where Latin American authors like Teotonio Santos, Vânia Van Beira, Rimaro Marini in Brazil, and others elsewhere were contesting the traditional views of how development would take place. And that is how Latin American Perspectives was born. We began with a debate in which we objected to the major article published in the issue, and we had debated it before the issue. And we brought in Stavenhagen and these others, including Cardoso. And it was amazing, because within 1 month we had 2,000 subscribers. To imagine a journal starting that way, when we had no contacts anywhere, it was just we didn't have the social media we have today, and so on. And from that point on, every issue that was published was reprinted with 2,000 copies. And now we're up to about 12 or 13,000 subscribers. And the journal is available everywhere in Latin America, and it's available in most universities. And we think that there is an audience out there of millions of people interested in Latin American perspectives. And it is, the idea here is that everybody is to participate. Thank you so much, everybody, for your kind words. It's more than I deserve. The attention here, I'm so glad the attention here is on LAP as well. And thank you, Gioconda, for such.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful tribute to Ron. Very well deserved. And on behalf of LASA, again, our warmest congratulations. I have to end this session. Thank you very much for everybody. We'll have this session on YouTube, so if you can share, so that you can share it with other people who were not able to attend. Yes, Kemi.
I have a question. Will there be another part of the ceremony, or this is it?
We have a meeting of Latin American Perspectives editors.
Okay.
No, this is it, Kemi.
This is it. Okay. I didn't want to miss, because I had said, it had said for Chile at 3 p.m., but no, it was an error. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gioconda.
Thank you. No, thank you all. Bye, and have a nice, I don't know,
Bye.
evening, so have a nice afternoon and so on.
A great baby, Joanna.
Right.
Thank you, Kemi.
Abrazos.